Okay, ready to go. All right, welcome, my friends, to episode 737 of Extreme Health Radio with Mr. Morley Robbins. We're going to talk today about iron toxicity, enzymes, copper, minerals, specifically related to neurodegeneration. And I was reading an interesting article on his website, actually. I think it's Iron Toxicity Post 61, where he talks about the amount of people that are suffering from neurological disorders. He said here, 1 billion people worldwide, 1 in 6 suffer from neurological disorders. And so we're going to talk about how minerals play a role. Whoops, here we go again. I forgot to turn that off. Sorry, guys. But we're going to talk about how minerals play a role in all of this and why certain people get Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, strokes, epilepsy, multiple sclerosis, and try to dig in and see if there is a component here of mineral dysregulation, which Morley contends that there is. So we'll introduce him in just a second. If you guys want to grab the show notes for today's show, you can find those at extremehealthradio.com/737. So just remember 737 is for today's show. And I'll try to put links to everything we talk about on that particular show page. And if you're new to our show, our new shows come out every Sunday evening. Around 10 p.m. Pacific time, roughly, give or take. And then the other 6 days of the week, we run our best of episodes. So if you subscribe on iTunes or anywhere else, you'll get shows 7 days a week with new shows on Sunday night. So make sure to do that so you don't miss any of the episodes that we have. There, some of them have been from a few years ago that are really still quite relevant. So with all of that said, I'm going to unmute Mr. Morley Robbins. And for those that don't know who he is, he's the author of the book Cure Your Fatigue. He is the founder of the Magnesium Advocacy Group and the creator of the Root Cause Protocol. In my mind, one of the most important people in the natural health industry today. Mr. Morley Robbins, how are you, my friend? Oh, I think you're muted. Okay, there we go. Ask to unmute.
Dude, there we go. Justin,
There we go.
I am doing great. I'm thrilled to be here as always, and looking forward to our exchange.
So I think we had a little bit of a debate. I believe this is episode 16 that we've done together.
You think it's 16? Okay, it very well may be.
I did a search, and I think that's it.
Well, this is Sweet 16 then. That's great.
That's right. Yeah, you're on podcast. You were just on Kitty Martone's podcast, I think, right?
I was. That was number 6 or 7 with her, and so no, I just love these conversations. And so Sweet 16, and then you're going to be coming into the RCP Institute with Group 16. I think that's very fitting.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
We're just wrapping up class number or group number 15. We've got 2 more classes, and then we've got a month off, and then we start back on the 7th of July.
Okay, July. So tell people a little bit about that, because I'm really excited to be a part of it. I can't wait to learn more. But it's now called the RCP Institute. Is that right?
Yeah. And it started 5 years ago. The first class was like 20 people, and what's very fitting is that we had the initial enrollment. Within the first hour, we had 25 people signed up.
Oh my goodness!
So we've got 142 people now signed up, and we're very excited about that. So we're probably going to have a class of about 200, 250 in group 16. So
wow, that's
a
awesome.
lot of fun. Yeah.
And so tell me the format of it, so I know what to look forward to, and the structure of it. How are you putting that together?
Well, you're going to love it because it's all online.
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to use your phone. Ha ha ha. But no, it's a 16-week program, 14 live classes. There's 2 practicum weeks built into it, so you can do case studies and things like that. There's a whole series of case studies to review. And so what we do is we have a pre-recorded material for each class that you view before the class. Then we have a Q&A period with the live class. And the live class is every Thursday at 3 o'clock Eastern. So that'll be
Okay.
12 o'clock your time.
Okay.
And they usually last between 2.5 to 3 hours.
Okay.
And we could be there easily for 6 hours with all the questions that people have and the discussion that we get into. But we try to cap it at 3 hours. And we always do a live case study with each class. And there's articles and books that people can read in addition to what they might have already done. And what we really got to do is start cataloging the podcasts. I mean, there's over 100 podcasts now, and we're probably up to about 150. But it'd be fun for people to know that there's categories of podcasts they can listen to, and
Yeah,
begin to
that's
just to
awesome.
flesh out.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because see,
That's
the thing is, what's nice about these types of conversations is it becomes a running dialogue.
mhm.
And so we get into a point where we start talking about some of the nuances and the subtleties of it, which is really important. Because when you talk to someone for the first time, you're just covering the bases.
Mhm.
This is first base, this is second base. In your situation, we've had enough conversations where you're just a curious George and you want to delve into deeper levels. And I think the gearheads out there love that because
Yeah,
they hear different nuances.
it's fascinating because when I go back and listen to the first show that we had together, my understanding of the mineral dysregulation, component was so minimal compared to what it is now. And so it's just really fun when you understand just how complex minerals are and how much they impact the body. And I don't know, growing in that understanding is really, really amazing. And then it just opens up another world of rabbit trails to go down and different things to try. It's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, no, it really is. I was just talking to a client here in North Carolina, and she starts down her litany of symptoms, H. pylori and Lyme disease, and low hemoglobin, and she had like 7 different symptoms. And I said, well, they're all related to the same thing. She said, how is that possible? So I explained to her the copper iron conflict with each of the 7 different conditions. She said, this is amazing. She says, why don't our doctors know this? I said, well, that's a good question. Don't ask me, ask your doctor why they don't know it. And my day started today, Justin, with a call at 7 o'clock from a doctor who said, I'd like to turn your RCP from a bike into a Tesla. Are you up for that? And I said, I don't know what you mean, but I said, I'm definitely game. Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, he's a very interesting guy. He's got 20,000 clients in his panel, and he's in Florida, and he wants to take this to another level, which I think would
Wow.
be very cool. So,
That would be.
yeah.
Wow, that's interesting. We had a person in our private academy that was telling me today that he was sharing the story. He's familiar with obviously you and your work, and he was telling me today that the doctors wanted to give his wife iron transfusions, and he was vehemently against it, and they turned it down, and are working and doing a lot of your protocols and managed to fix the situation. But I told him, I said, dude, you just saved your wife's life by preventing an iron transfusion. That's incredible that doctors don't know what that's actually doing to their bodies.
Yeah. Yeah. The funny thing is that the folks I knew in college who all ended up in medical school all got A's in calculus to a person, every one of them,
Mm-hmm.
really, really good at high order math. And now they've been turned into monkeys with a ruler, high and low. And
Uh-huh.
it's like they're back in kindergarten, and they're trying to measure the dynamic of iron. Iron metabolism is actually copper iron metabolism is
Mm-hmm.
probably the most sophisticated, most complicated but most misunderstood part of our physiology. And they're using high-low terminology.
It's
It's really
wild.
scary. It really
Yeah.
is wild. It's kind of scary. And it affects every facet of our physiology, as you well know.
Yeah, it's wild. So in terms of relating to neurological diseases, like in your article Iron 61 on your website, you mentioned that there's 1 billion people around the world dealing with neurological diseases. So let's start diving into that a little bit and find out how the mineral dysregulation piece and specifically iron overload is playing into that.
Yeah. No, so we've got, so just for starters, it's good for people to know that we live on a planet with oxygen, and the oxygen needs to be transported, which is the job of the red blood cells. The hemoglobin inside the red blood cells holds and carries the oxygen, but the oxygen has to be activated, has to be turned into water to allow the release of energy. It's a big deal. And so all of the optics are on the transportation of oxygen, and zero attention is given to the activation of oxygen. And
Mm-hmm.
why is this important for the brain? Well, the brain represents 2% of the body weight, but it represents 20% of the oxygen that's being consumed by the body.
Mm.
So the word consuming oxygen, or the word respiration, let's use that word. Respiration, we know that means breathing in and out of our lungs, right?
Mm-hmm.
But at a cellular level, it means oxygen is being consumed. Oxygen is being used.
Uh-huh.
Oxygen is being activated. And guess what? You can't activate oxygen without copper. And so the part of the what's disorienting is to think about the number of mitochondria that are in our brain. So we have about 100 billion neurons in our brain. That's a lot, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some of the brain regions have 2 million mitochondria. I mean, the substantia nigra, which is at the base of the center of the brain, very important for coordination and balance and movement, has it's cataloged that it has 2 million mitochondria in those neurons. And no, it's just like, and what each of those mitochondria is supposed to have is 50,000 atoms of copper. So we're getting into some big numbers here. And so we've got 20% of the oxygen is running through these 100 billion cells. They've got millions, up to millions of mitochondria. They need a lot of copper. And who's talking about copper in the brain? Not many people. You know, Ashley Bush down at University of Melbourne, and Jamie Collins at Florida, or University of Florida in Gainesville.
Mm-hmm.
There may be probably a dozen scientists around the world that are worrying about copper in the brain. Garth Cooper, famous copper researcher who's based in University of Manchester. And so the big fight in neurodegeneration is, oh, it's copper causing all these problems. You'll bump up against the work of George Brewer pretty quickly. He's now retired from University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, but back in the day, he was a big proponent of the fact that copper was causing all the problems.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's all a matter of perspective, right? Like we were having trouble getting connected a few minutes ago, right? we couldn't get the lines of communication to sync up. Well,
Right.
in the brain, what happens is copper is coming into the brain tissue, and there's something called the blood-brain barrier. It's a very important membrane that keeps the bad guys out so that the good guys can get into the brain tissue. And under the right conditions, when copper is coming out of the ceruloplasm, the whole dynamic of copper begins to change, And copper does become unbound. But what a lot of scientists didn't seem to understand is that there's something called lipid rafts in the blood-brain barrier that allow the copper to come through and get on the other side so it can be reactivated and
So
re-engaged.
explain what that is again.
They're called lipid rafts. And those lipid rafts are activated by copper, and they're allowing the movement of proteins and nutrients to come from one side of the blood-brain barrier to the other. And it's all a matter of perspective. So George Brewer was measuring copper on the outside of the blood-brain barrier, and Garth Cooper was measuring copper on the other side of the blood-brain barrier. So it's, when you get into the world of neurodegeneration, it really matters which side of the blood-brain barrier you're on, and really understanding what's the physiology of the body and how does it work. And so, like in the case of Garth Cooper, he did an amazing study in 2016 where he was looking at glucose consumption in the neurons, in the neurons of the hippocampus, which is where Alzheimer's takes place. And what he was able to prove is that it was a copper deficiency of those mitochondria in those neurons that didn't allow sugars to be metabolized, be oxidized properly. And it was a definitive study because he totally changed the orientation of the focus. He moved beyond the blood-brain barrier and got down into the neurons. And that's where the action is. And so people have to be really careful about the headlines they read, be very careful about the pablum that they're reading on the internet about this and that causing neurodegeneration. At the end of the day, it's all about energy production. And the energy that the brain needs to produce is enormous to keep track of all of the subtleties of our physiology. And it all has to stem or flow from the fact that nutrients are being oxidized efficiently in the brain tissue. And if copper's not there to do it, it is not going to happen.
So in your article, you mentioned about Alzheimer's disease, since you just brought that up, and you said it's characterized by the following mineral patterns in the brain tissue. You say high copper, low iron, low zinc, low ferroxidase function, high oxidized serotonin, especially in the hippocampus, and confusing references to monoamine oxidase, MAO, as a bad guy that is meant to turn off neurotransmitters, and the silence of melanin's role in the locus coeruleus that affects the hippocampus. So with Alzheimer's, you say high copper, low iron. Is that right?
Well, again, the thing is, it depends on where we're talking about. When I wrote that several years ago, I didn't have this refined understanding of which side of the blood-brain barrier we on. And so the classic measurements, what that's referring to is copper and iron in the blood, which is going to be on the outside of the blood-brain barrier.
Oh,
And
okay.
And so the research, the really definitive research now is on the inside of the blood-brain barrier so that we can understand what's happening inside the neuron, inside the mitochondria, and it's a completely different dynamic. But the high-low that I'm talking about there is talking about in the blood. And that's the classic dichotomy between Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And so Parkinson's, it's going to say it's low copper, high iron. And that's just the opposite of Alzheimer's. But again, that's on the outside of the blood-brain barrier. You have to be really careful. The subtleties of this are tricky. And what people want is simple. And unfortunately, it's not always simple. But once you learn the basics, and once you put it into an energy paradigm, it all makes perfect sense. And so the reason why it becomes the neurodegeneration is taking place, whether it's in the hippocampus or the substantia nigra or the locus coeruleus or wherever, is that oxidative stress is taking over and causing a breakdown of the tissue.
What's the relationship you said of the oxidized serotonin in the hippocampus? How
Well,
does that play a role?
the well the neurotransmitters are very, very important, and they are responding to the state of oxidative stress inside the cell. And the mitochondria is making these neurotransmitters. And if iron is not being properly recycled inside the cell the way it's supposed to, that iron is going to cause rusting. And the rusting of serotonin is attached to the dynamic of Alzheimer's. And there's nuances of this. Why does one person get Alzheimer's, another person get Huntington's disease, another person get Parkinson's?
Hmm.
I'm not sure anyone really knows that. The mechanism, the background mechanism is the same. I think it has to do with emotional patterns and neurotransmitter patterns that might exist in the body and in the brain. And we're getting into a level of sophistication that's probably beyond our pay grade.
What is the overall worldwide incidence of Parkinson's? It's got to be really high, right?
It is. It's not as high as Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's is hands down the biggest threat to society right now from a neurodegenerative standpoint. Um, I think it's heart's disease continues to be the number one killer on the planet.
Hmm.
Cancer is second and soon to be number one. And then neurodegeneration would be the third once we get past the iatrogenic diseases. So neurodegeneration is a huge, huge factor. The number of Alzheimer's, I would guess, is probably 3 to 1 Alzheimer's to Parkinson's would
Mm.
be a rough estimate.
I like what Robert Scott Bell says. He always says that iatrogenic death is classified as the third leading cause of death in the world. But he says since doctors are involved in numbers 1 and 2, you could say that iatrogenic death is the number one cause. You know?
Yeah, yeah. If we want to go for the jugular, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
That's
That's
interesting.
very. And the thing
It's
is,
fast.
I don't think people realize how significant this is. We're at an unprecedented time period, and again, all the optics are on other conditions that people have been dealing with the last couple of years, and I get that. But raging in the background, there's been no abatement of heart disease, cancer, neurodegeneration, diabetes, liver disease. These classic chronic conditions are still like bulldozers going through society worldwide.
Hmm.
And
Yeah, it's wild. Like most people are being diagnosed. I think I read a study. If you're born after 1960, like there used to be different causes or people percentages of people getting diagnosed with cancer, but now it's 50% across the board if you're born after 1960.
yeah, absolutely. It's
Crazy.
back in I think it was after the turn of 1900, the incidence of cancer was like 1 in 100. It was very rare. Now it's 1 in 2. Well, that's not genetic. That's an engineered change in the farming, food practices, and pharmaceutical system. It's an unescapable change in our environment that's causing this breakdown. And people just need to wake up to what's going on. And again, you know me well enough to know you're talking to somebody who doesn't believe in disease. It doesn't exist. And what I really enjoyed this morning when I was talking to this doctor, he said, "You're absolutely right about that." He said, "You're absolutely right. There is no disease." So it's just, there are not enough practitioners who are willing to state it quite that directly.
Yeah, and it's kind of wild because you can chase every disease. I think Dr. Carolyn Dean was mentioning in her book that there's like 30,000
Yeah,
known sort of labels for diseases, and you can go after each one of those individually. But when you realize like your whole thing is called the root cause protocol, and so the root cause is always going to be oxidation in relation to iron and mineral dysregulation, right?
absolutely. And again, there's an aspect to it that's like, oh, come on, it's too simple. The funny thing is the people who are drawn to the root cause protocol are high IQ. So I always tease people. I said, well, we've now proven that you have high IQ, and I said, but people with high IQ have 2 genetic defects. And they go, what? I said, yeah, we're control freaks and we love complexity. And so when I'm telling you that all you got to do is do the RCP, it's like your high IQ mind says, well, it's got to be more complicated than that. And that's what trips people up all the time. It's like, no, it doesn't. I was just talking to a practitioner today. Um, she works in a different area of nutritional counseling. She's going to be in your class 16. And she said, everyone's talking about the RCP. I said, well, I think that's great. I said, I'm just curious, what do people outside of the RCP say about the RCP? And she paused and she said, people love the simplicity of it. I said, oh, that's pretty cool. She said, so many of these other programs are so convoluted and complicated, and they're not getting the results that they want. And they're seeing results with the RCP. I said, well, that's very kind of you to share that. So I'd never heard that before. So it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, it's cool understanding the reason why, because I know you've mentioned before that people have called you the thinking man's nutritionist, but like understanding, because I listen to a lot of different radio shows, and the guests will say, in terms of, I was listening to one this morning where the guest was recommending a series of herbs for elevated PSA levels for people, and I forgot what the herbs were, but I was just thinking to myself as I'm listening to this, yes, you could take herbs to lower a number, but why is this process happening? And someone in our academy today was talking about high blood pressure, and there's things that you can do, obviously, to lower your blood pressure from a natural perspective. But, I was saying that, at some point in your life, you weren't doing these things and your blood pressure was normal. So it's not that your body needs these things, it's that your body's not working right. And that's where I feel like a lot of your protocol comes into place, is understanding why the body's not working right and why it raises the blood pressure.
Yeah. And the thing is, um, anyone with blood pressure issues has inadequate potassium, but then they've got to find out why. What the biggest cause of potassium loss is too much iron in the cell. So it's like, okay, well, why is there too much iron in the cell? Because the mitochondria are not recycling it right, and or I think the other, getting back to our earlier discussion, what's playing in the background of both Alzheimer's and Parkinson's and all these other neurodegenerative diseases is a lack of optimal ceruloplasmin function. It's one thing to know the level of ceruloplasmin in the blood. That's like knowing someone's height.
Mm-hmm.
It's another thing to know, is the enzyme function of the protein expressing. That's like knowing their IQ. Knowing
Mm-hmm.
someone's height does not help you understand their IQ. And I think it's the lack of IQ of this critical copper protein that leads to the neurodegeneration, because iron is not being regulated, not being recycled, and it will cause rust. And it rusts different parts of the brain region depending upon the dynamics of the individual. And that's a fact. And it's well established in the literature, but you got to ask different kinds of questions of Dr. Google. You can't ask simple questions. You got to get to the understanding of what's really playing in the background. And it's oxidative stress. Hands down, that's what's ravaging humanity on the planet. And we got to get to why is the oxidative stress rising? Well, the oxygen isn't being activated properly to make energy. That's a problem right there. That
Mm-hmm.
means there's a lack of copper. The exhaust that's given off in that process, there's always going to be exhaust. Just like when we're driving a car, is there exhaust coming out? Of course there is. But when that exhaust becomes billowing smoke, that's called oxidative stress. And there are enzymes designed to neutralize that excessive oxidative stress. Those enzymes are all copper dependent. And when you can't activate oxygen and you can't clear the exhaust, that's when iron begins to really flex its muscles and changes the metabolic activity of the mitochondria and the cell. And then suddenly you have a complete breakdown of the function of the tissue.
There's a 2014 study that said a link between EMF, iron accumulation in the brain, and neurodegenerative disorders, including Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, has been suggested. What are your thoughts about the EMF component to this, do you think?
Well, EMF is a major stressor. I can't think of a bigger stressor on the planet right now, especially the 5G.
Hmm.
And 5G changes the dynamic of oxygen. Oxygen does not behave the same in the presence of 5G electromagnetic frequencies as opposed to 2G, 3G, 4G. So
Hmm.
the oxygen molecule is different. So then you've got the potential for greater oxidative stress. Well, if you're showing a deficit for copper, then you're going to have a real challenge. But the other thing is, when we're under acute stress, we're going to lose magnesium. And what most folks may not know about is there's a channel in the cell called it's called the L-type calcium channel, LTCC,
Okay.
L-type calcium channel.
Hmm.
And people have heard of calcium channel blockers. Well, people who have heart disease usually will have some kind of calcium channel blocker medication. And you think that it's blocking calcium because it's called a calcium channel, right?
Right.
Well, well, what what protects that calcium channel is a magnesium ion. And under acute stress, the magnesium ion pops out. And you would think the calcium would flow in, right?
Uh-huh.
But it's iron that flows in. And then suddenly iron overwhelms the copper metabolism. And that's the genius of Jamie Collins at the University of Florida. He's done a lot of work on how too much iron over um, takes over and threatens the copper in the cell and in the tissue. And so suddenly it's the perfect foil. No one knows that this is happening, and no one's talking about that with 5G. And
Hmm.
they know people know they don't feel right. They don't know why they don't feel right, and it's because the entire metabolic dynamic of the cell is being threatened by the stress of the frequency that's affecting the minerals.
And I imagine too that heavy metals, other heavy metals like aluminum and cadmium and things like that, are also interacting with 5G and non-native EMF as well, right?
But potentially, I've never really studied the EMF with the other metals.
Uh-huh.
I'm squarely focused on the biggest threat to our well-being. The heavy metal that everyone needs to be worried most about is called iron. And
Mhm.
there are many other heavy metals, that you just named. And so we get distracted with those other heavy metals, not knowing that the liver, when it has proper levels of copper, knows exactly what to do with those other heavy metals. It really does. And the lack of copper affects all of the heavy metals. And a liver that doesn't have enough copper is going to start to accumulate iron first and foremost. And I can assure you, it's iron that's going to do the most damage.
Isn't it wild how these things are like on seesaws or they're on cyclical loops, because the lack of copper is going to cause iron to rise. But then when iron rises, so does oxidation and inflammation. And then magnesium's lowered to deal with that. And then, copper is further depleted. It's like this cycle that just goes around and round, right? It's wild.
Well, it is. And, I'm sure there are people in the audience, worrying about copper toxicity. And so let's take that one on head on,
Hmm.
um, because I think it's a misnomer. And it was really there was something about the term that got to me years ago, and that's really what got me to study copper, to really understand what its job is, why it's here on the planet. And there's two aspects to this rising copper in the blood that I think people need to understand. First of all, the word that very few mineral practitioners who are aligned with the term copper toxicity, the word that they never really want to talk about is ceruloplasmin. Why? Because most of them only do hair tests. They don't do blood tests to find out what's really going on with copper and iron and zinc and magnesium and some of the other key nutrients that we can study to have a better contextual understanding of what's going on with copper. They never talk about ceruloplasmin, and they certainly don't talk about ferroxidase and what's happening with iron. So that's ding number one, is if they're not talking about ceruloplasmin, then they're not fully understanding the copper dynamic. Then the other thing that I came across recently, it's fascinating. We've been trained, like circus bears, to believe that when copper comes out of ceruloplasmin, it's a bad boy. It's so bad, and that's what George Brewer got everyone all wrapped around that axle, and William Walsh and people of that stature, and they're very well intentioned, but there's a reason why the ceruloplasmin protein released that copper. It's really important, because it's a part of the basic immune system of the body. That when the immune system senses that there's a pathogen, it's going to send a signal to ceruloplasmin, release the hounds. Now, why would the body want to release these copper hounds? Well, it turns out that when there's a rise of what's called unbound copper unbound from ceruloplasmin, let's use the term properly, copper unbound from ceruloplasmin. That's actually the phrase that Carl Pfeiffer used originally back in the 60s, and then it got shortened to unbound copper. Oh, it's bad. And so the copper comes unbound from ceruloplasmin. It activates interleukin 8. And guess what interleukin 8 does? It activates the neutrophils. And who are the neutrophils? They are the Marines of the immune system. They're the first ones on the scene. And so there's this conserved response in our immune system that's activated by the unbound copper to preserve our well-being. And what do practitioners do when they see this rising state of unbound copper? Let's suck it up as much as we can. Let's get rid of it. Now, which makes no sense at all. And then the third and final salvo is, what people don't realize is that when we're talking about unbound copper, or when we're talking about copper in the blood, what percent of the copper are we talking about, Justin?
Copper in the blood versus in the tissues or in the liver?
Yeah, we're in the tissue. Copper in the blood versus copper in the tissue. What's the percentage distribution?
Oh gosh, I have no idea.
And you and nobody else, right? So it turns out that the amount of copper in the blood is 1%. 99% is in the tissue. And we're basing our decisions on 1% change based on some kind of environmental threat, and a complete disregard for the impact that these copper chelators are having on metabolic, energetic function in the tissue throughout the body.
But wouldn't the amount in the blood vary based on someone's retinol status?
It could, but again, we're not talking about 1% suddenly becoming 10%. It's going to be a bell-shaped curve around 1%. Okay. It's not going to be this, and we're led to believe that suddenly it goes from 1% to 99%. That's not what happens at all. It's very subtle changes, and the whole idea is that the body is. I think we lose sight of the wisdom of the body, and we're losing sight of probably the most, in my opinion. And I know I'm kind of goofy about it, but in my opinion, copper is the most important mineral to regulate the body. I mean, think about what copper does. There are only 4 jobs that copper does. Let's talk about each of them. 1, it creates energy. 2, it clears exhaust. 3, it catalyzes oxygen-based enzymes. They're called oxidase enzymes. And basically what you're doing is you're seizing the energy of oxygen and using it for some good. And the 4th thing it does is it combats enemies. Those are the only 4 functions that copper does, but it's the only mineral in the body that does all 4 of them. I think it's like, to me, it's a no-brainer. What, why are people struggling to understand this? And so it's just, we get into the name calling and all sorts of alarmist statements about what this copper toxicity was. And I've actually had several clients in the last few months say, I think I know what's going on. When my copper became unbound, or when I started working with this copper, is it possible that I might have mobilized my iron and that the iron was causing the symptoms? I said, that's exactly what it was doing. And the symptoms of dysregulated iron is what's causing what is perceived as copper toxicity. And so
Mhm.
all of the optics are in the wrong places. So I just wanted to touch on that because that's something that's been rattling around in my cranium for a while, and I wanted to at least get that out there for the record.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense. Would you say, in general, in terms of neurological diseases, that the primary issue, depending on how it expresses in people's body, is going to be a rise in oxidation from iron overload and a lack of copper and retinol and these bioavailable minerals? And that may express for someone as, Alzheimer's, for someone else as Parkinson's. But in general, do you think that's the core cause of what's going on with neurodegenerative issues?
Yeah, and it's not me just making this assertion. I'm basing it on the genius work of people like Ashley Bush or Christensen, and I mean, there's a whole Garth Cooper. There's a whole network of practitioners who've been studying this very carefully. Um, um, Leslie Clavet and others. So the thing is, um, I say that my stance is not an opinion. It's based on a compendium of research. And
Hmm.
I'm just pulling the curtain back on the research that no one seems to know about or seems to want to talk about. And it's out there. You have to be persistent. You have to be a little bit of a pit bull terrier to find it, to read it, then understand it, make sure you're reading it properly. But it just takes time. And I think the reason why the number of people being drawn to the RCP training in increasing numbers is people are waking up to the reality of, well, maybe we do need to simplify this model of healing and get it back to this basic foundational balance between copper and magnesium and iron. And let's get this protein ceruloplasmin working right. And let's see what the body does then. See how the immune system functions, because it's right now it's completely out of control. And this idea, again, the whole basis of healing today, for the most part, is directed at enemies. If it's not some pathogen, it's some heavy metal, it's some toxin. And I don't think there's adequate attention being given to energy. So my phrase is ignore the enemies, let's ignite the energy. And when the body is making energy, when the organs are making energy, when the tissue is making energy, I assure you that the exhaust is getting cleared, the enzymes are being catalyzed properly, and the pathogens can't exist in that environment.
Do you think
Pathogens cannot exist in a high energy environment.
that makes sense? Do you think that it's possible for someone? I don't know if there are stages in neurological diseases like they try to put on cancer, where it's stage 1 or 2, but someone with a further stage, if for lack of a better term, neurological disorder like Alzheimer's or something. Do you think it's possible if that person were to do everything correctly to get them out of that condition?
I don't think it's, I know it is. And it's um, for people who are somewhat doubtful, they might look up the research of the Fair Park Roman 2 trial. It's a European trial using an iron chelator called deferiprone, Deferiprone. Fair Park is FAIRPARK. Fair Park Roman 2. And this was a 2.5 year study in Europe. And in January, they declared victory over Parkinson's.
Wow.
So that so we're just at the beginning stages of this. And so there's a whole spectrum of iron chelators that are now coming online. But the problem is the overwhelming majority of practitioners, whether they are allopathic, chiropractic, homeopathic, osteopathic, it doesn't matter what their branch is,
Hmm.
they truly believe that people are anemic and copper toxic. And what the research is telling us is, no, it's just the opposite. We know that there's a copper deficiency. We know there's an iron overload in the tissue. It may not show up in the blood, but in the tissue, there absolutely is an overload, especially in the neurodegenerative conditions.
Hmm.
And we now have mechanisms to reverse that. And it's going to take a resolve and maybe a near revolution to try to change the thinking of the practitioners because they are deeply entrenched in their training.
Oh yeah. Do you think any of these iron chelators, let's say they're not natural, of course they're going to be synthetic. Do you think there's hope for any one of those being something that would you would ever incorporate into RCP, or if someone wanted to follow that and then also do RCP, like are there any that seem interesting to you?
Well, I think that they all seem interesting, and in fact, things like quercetin. Well, that's an iron chelator. People know about wormwood. That's an iron chelator. There are natural iron chelators out there, and these more so-called sophisticated, we'll just call them synthetic. These other iron chelators are based on the actions of Mother Nature. They're just doing it on a bigger scale. And I, you're asking an interesting question about, does that become a part of the RCP? I guess what I would say is that if someone is not getting the results that they want, if they have, a full-blown situation with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's and have had it for a number of years, I'm not sure the RCP is going to reverse that, but the RCP as a foundation, and then introducing these more advanced forms of chelation, and maybe even copper infusion, and maybe through nebulizing it or through IV or even suppository.
Uh-huh.
There may be delivery modalities that we've never even thought of that will be essential to support the rebalancing of these metals. Yeah.
Yeah, because the
Again,
trick is getting the iron out of the brain, right?
yeah, exactly. So how old are your sons?
Oh my gosh, they're going to be 4 next month, little boys of
Okay,
terror.
okay, little boys of terror. God bless them, and I hope you lose all your hair over them. And but the thing is, um, the RCP is your son's age plus one. We're
Hmm.
5 years into this. Now, how old are you?
46.
Okay. Can you imagine what the RCP is going to be like when it's your age?
I
When we've
imagine
had,
this. Oh, it's going to be incredible.
yeah, exactly. So we're we're an infancy stage. Think about how it's going to mature and refine over the next 4 decades. And I think that's what this doctor was saying. I'm ready to help you take your protocol from being a bike to being a Tesla. He has ideas I never even dreamt of, and he wants to partner over it because he thinks there's an opportunity worldwide to help stem the tide of all of this, not just neurodegeneration, metabolic degeneration. The fastest growing disease on the planet is non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, hands down. It's taking off like a rocket. And what's the job of the liver? To store and metabolize copper and retinol. And what's it been turned into? An iron locker. Because if you don't have copper in your diet, you will have iron in your liver. And that's a fact. We've known that since 1928. And it's been reestablished and reaffirmed and even proven genetically in 2021 with the work of Kim and Gonzalez. So again, people don't know this research has been done. And people don't realize that just these few mineral levers that we talk about are at the very basis of all metabolic breakdown that causes all of the symptoms that people have. And Carolyn Dean's absolutely right. The Merck manual has like 32,000 conditions in it. There's only
Mhm.
one thing missing, in the Merck manual. There's not one word about the protagonist called bioavailable copper. That phrase does not appear in the Merck manual.
Yeah, it's wild. It's wild. Okay, so we have a ton of questions, so I feel like we should get to some of those. But I wanted to ask you
That's
one
good.
quick thing
Yeah,
before we
sure.
get to some of those. I wonder if in the future, like you were mentioning, the evolution of the RCP program, I wonder if in the future, if there will be an iron chelator, whether synthetic or natural. Well, I guess it would have to be synthetic if it were invented, that could pull iron from the tissues too quickly. Do you think that's possible? And because it seems like that could cause an issue as well, right?
Yeah, that it's a really good question. I don't know that I have the answer. Um, the what we're up against, Justin, is there is no manual that I'm aware of, and trust me, I've been looking for it, but there is no manual on how to de-iron the human being. And so we're doing our level best to try to reverse the buildup of iron that's taken place over the last century. And people don't realize that we are the proverbial frogs being boiled 1 degree at a time, and have been
Hmm.
for the last 100 years. And there have been a lot of changes in farming, food practices, and in pharmaceuticals that have altered the balance of power between copper and iron. And what you're raising is a really key question: is invariably, once people know that there's a way to reverse this, they want to do it yesterday. Get rid
Uh,
of it. I want to get it out of my body. And I mean, I've had people that have done blood donations, you know, weeks apart. I'm like, no, you don't do that. That doesn't make it. No, I'm serious. I had no idea they were doing it. They thought it was okay to do it. I'm like, no, you don't do that. You follow the rules, do what the Red Cross says. But the thing is, people get impatient, they get fearful, excuse me, and they want to rush a process that's been building in their body for decades. And we've
mhm.
got to be really careful about that. So I think it's a very sensitive issue that you're raising, and we don't know. And I think that's going to be one of the most important areas of exploration, is to see how quickly can we do this. I typically tell people it's going to take 18 months to 2 years.
Mhm.
What I in my conversation this morning with this physician, he said, I want to do it in 2 months. I said, well, that's aggressive, and let's explore it and see what that might mean. I have no idea whether that's possible.
Yeah, that's interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah,
Okay, so Morley, we have a ton of questions here, so we'll try to get through them as quickly as possible. But I will
sure.
say on the first question that we have that I'm going to give to you, I have to go to the bathroom. So take a little bit longer with this one because this one's kind of a I know you can go longer with it. Okay. So I'm going to go to the bathroom right when you start answering it. But the first question is how to raise extremely low ferritin levels. Okay. Okay. And I'll be
Oh,
right back.
that's good. That sounds good. Okay. All right. So ferritin is arguably one of the most misunderstood concepts on the planet, certainly in doctors' offices. So um, ferritin it's an iron storage protein that is supposed to be found in the tissue inside the cell. It's not supposed to be showing up in the blood. And when I had an opportunity to talk with Douglas Kell, who's a world-renowned iron biologist at the University of Manchester, I asked him, I said, Dr. Kell, what's the ideal ferritin for a human? And he said, 0. I said, what? And he smiled. He said, well, I want to make sure you understand this. He said, rising ferritin in the blood is not a sign of iron vitality. It's a sign of organ pathophysiology. He said, do you understand what I just said? I said, yes, sir. I've read your articles. I've read a number of other articles about this. He said, it's important. The mistake we've got is that we're always looking for different ways to measure iron status. And from the time of the Civil War to 1972, doctors knew to measure iron status through hemoglobin. Why? Well, that's where 70% of the iron in our body is. It's found in the hemoglobin. Another 10% is in myoglobin, which is in the muscles. So between myoglobin and hemoglobin, we've got 80% of the iron in the body. What does ferritin represent? It's around 10% of the iron is found in storage in the cell. And the challenge we've got is there are different types of ferritin. And there is ferritin that's like an ATM machine where you can put iron in and take iron out.
Mhm.
And then there's ferritin like a bank vault that requires a key and a combination, and the manager's on vacation. So the iron goes in but never comes back out. And so when someone is asking about low ferritin, they're worrying about it in their blood. And when Dr. Kell said 0, I knew I couldn't possibly recommend that people get it down to 0 because people think I
Right.
was crazy. But I got it. But my sweet spot is between 20 and 30. And what I find is that when people, it's the bookends of this marker that are the problem. So that when the ferritin, the serum ferritin, rises above 150 for a woman or 300 for a man, I know that they're having liver issues, that there's a breakdown of liver in the body. When it's below 20, I know there's another dynamic that's taking place. And what's really going on is it's a very likely sign of parasites. And what's happening is there's all sorts of dysregulation with a protein called transferrin, and that's a iron transport protein. And when that begins to get dysregulated and it begins to rise, and it turns out that parasites have the ability to make transferrin. So then there's this artificial elevation of what's called TIBC, total iron binding capacity. And invariably, when I find a high TIBC and a low serum ferritin, I know I've got someone who's got parasites. So to answer the very specific question I was asked, how do I raise my serum ferritin? You've got to do the RCP, but you've got to deal with the copper iron dysregulation that's causing the parasites to rise in your body. And where they're taking place is invariably in the spleen and in the liver. So it's a very different perspective. A lot of practitioners out there say, "Oh, you just need more iron." And what happens is people will take that supplemental iron. They might even get iron infusions, and
Mhm.
it will force the serum ferritin to rise for a matter of weeks, and then it will fall back down because the ferritin that's showing up in that blood is being secreted by the liver after it's discharged the iron. It's a very subtle aspect of iron physiology that this marker that was identified in 1972 by Dr. Jacobs and his hematology team in London. They turned the spotlight from hemoglobin to serum ferritin, and mankind has never been the same since. It was one of the worst things they could have done. And it's a source of distraction. It's a source of confusion. And because of that, I've renamed ferritin, and I call it errortin, because more mistakes are made misinterpreting what a low or high ferritin means. And it's a source of a lot of iron infusions that take place throughout the country and around the world.
Interesting. Okay. So next question is, it's kind of a dual question. How do I raise hemoglobin and how do I prepare for a blood donation? Tips on that.
Yeah. So let's assume you've got optimal hemoglobin. Optimal hemoglobin would be 12.5 to 13.5 for a woman, 14.5 to 15.5 for a guy.
Hmm.
Guys can hold more iron because we have more testosterone, and we'll just leave it at that. We can hold more iron.
Hmm.
The other thing is that women are designed for blood loss, They have monthly blood loss, so their hemoglobin level is going to be that much lower. So if everything is normal, what you do to prepare for blood donation is eat well, certainly have good meals for the few days before the blood donation. Make sure you're hydrating properly. I would be doing adrenal cocktails too, just to make sure you're getting the minerals that you need. And once you do the blood donation, it should go very smoothly. There should be no issue.
Mhm.
Uh, some people do have low hemoglobin, and it's what's hard to believe is that this really critical iron marker is regulated by copper status. But that's the work of Max Weintraub and George Cartwright and a team of people at the University of Utah back in the 1950s. They were pretty clear about what was really going on. That research and that methodology is not taught in doctor school today. So there's a lot of confusion about it. So usually when people have low hemoglobin, uh, very often people will perk up just by doing the RCP. That's one wave. Sometimes people need to incorporate just by having focused attention around beef liver. That
Mhm.
will very often do the trick. Sometimes people need to increase their intake of chlorophyll. The chemical structure of chlorophyll and the chemical structure of hemoglobin are identical, with one
Mhm.
exception. Magnesium in chlorophyll and iron in the hemoglobin. And there's legendary examples of people reversing their so-called anemia by taking chlorophyll. So that's an option. Another is to Susie Cohen sells a antioxidant called catalase, and what can typically break down the hemoglobin is oxidative stress in the blood, and there may be an inadequate level of catalase in the blood. That's a great way to build it up. And then the other thing that people can do is there's something called prebiotics that have inulin. So we have probiotics and prebiotics. Prebiotics feed the good bacteria in our gut. And
Mhm.
it turns out that the prebiotic, through its inulin, help to release the iron that's stuck in the digestive tract and get that iron into the bone marrow so that more hemoglobin can be made. So there are a
Interesting.
number of different ways that it can be addressed.
Well, it's interesting because you mentioned copper. Gosh, I shouldn't add on to that, but isn't ferroportin copper dependent, which allows iron to get out of the cell, and wouldn't that through transferrin
Absolutely.
get back to the red blood cells or to the bone marrow?
That, no, you're absolutely right. And so it's just what is this person's diet? To what extent are they doing the RCP? Have they
Hmm.
discovered the recuperate that has the copper in it? And is that, really what, at the end of the day, I take the stance that there is no such thing as anemia of iron deficiency. It doesn't exist. Anemia of copper deficiency, now there's the real pandemic on the planet, as far as
Hmm.
I'm concerned. That's where the confusion is.
Okay, so next question, I should get better at these instead of offering my. Let's
That's
see. So the title of this show is iron toxicity in the brain, and so this person said, "Is this the cause of severe brain fog and chronic mental exhaustion?"
yeah. So the brain fog is a buildup of ammonia that's not being broken down in the liver, which is not good. And there's four key enzymes to break down ammonia in the liver. And as you might expect, the first one is copper dependent. So when copper can't clear that first enzyme, then you just have this residual buildup of ammonia. The exhaustion that they're experiencing is just overall their body is not able to metabolize their stress.
Hmm.
I've used the quotation by Mark Hyman. Um, the best definition of stress I've ever come across is his, which is stress is the body's inability to make energy for the mind to respond to its environment. And so when we're under stress and being on the planet is stressful. We will always have stress until we are 6 feet under. But if we cannot make energy so that we can perceive our environment, then we will have fatigue. And that mental exhaustion will do us in.
Interesting. There's a good question about approximately how much iron does a woman offload during a normal period?
Um, it really depends on who you're talking with. But I think the average that's typically uh, discussed is um, 60 to 80 milligrams
Oh,
of
really?
blood. 60 not milligrams. Are you asking about iron or blood loss?
It says here iron.
Okay, so iron. So hold on here. So yeah, so it's going to be 60 to 80. I think it's, I'm going to say milliliters, and then you'd multiply that by like 40%. And so you're going to get down into much smaller numbers. But there are women in the RCP community who measure their blood loss, and it's closer to 200 milliliters. So the iron loss would be around 100. So it might fluctuate between 30 milligrams to 100 milligrams of iron in a body that has maybe 4 to 5,000 milligrams of iron. So again, we don't, we have to be mindful of um, the numbers are not as big as we might have thought. Because I think the traditional stance that doctors take is when a woman has anemia, again, low iron in the blood, that they perceive as anemia of iron deficiency. It's from the blood loss from their menstrual cycle, and it's like there's just not enough there. And
Hmm.
so it's a breakdown in the iron recycling program that's copper dependent, just as you noted with ferroportin. Iron's not getting back to the bone marrow, and it's not being built back into the new red blood cells. And just to give people order of magnitude, every second of every day, we need to make 2.5 million red blood cells. And in the course of 24 hours, it's 2 trillion red blood cells. So it's an enormous activity, very energy dependent. But here's the catch: it only takes 25 milligrams of iron to support each day's turnover. And it's that 25 milligrams is being turned over every day. It's not like you have to have 25 every day. That's times 30. I need bazillions of, no, it's 25 milligrams is devoted to the recycling system. And 95% of it, 24 of those 25 milligrams are coming from recycling, and 1 is coming from the diet.
I was
Very
listening
different numbers, than what people think.
I was listening to a professor, like an Australian guy. I forget his name, but he was doing a YouTube lecture at a university called Iron Toxicity or Iron Overload or something. And he was saying the average American consumes about 10 to 20 milligrams of iron a day. And I just, man, that's unreal. Because I did the math. I did an Instagram post a while back about how, because you mentioned that the amount of iron we actually have stored in our tissues is our age times 365. And
Right.
so I did the math about, okay, if I consume 3 milligrams of iron per day, I'm 46 years old and I had like 17,000 milligrams of iron. And if I consume 3 milligrams of iron per day, how long would it take to finally get down to 5,000 milligrams, right? And
Yeah.
so I estimated, or through my math, I figured out that it would take about 13 years to do that. But in
Yeah.
those 13 years, I would have accumulated another 13,000 milligrams of iron by only ingesting 3 milligrams a day. And so when I heard this guy say we consume 20 milligrams, I was like, dude, you're never going to get out of that cycle that way.
Justin, there are some prenatal supplements that women take that have 65 milligrams. I've had clients who've been told by their doctor to take iron supplements where there's 325 milligrams of iron on a daily basis.
Oh my
So they're
God.
taking, yeah, I mean, it's completely out of control because they don't understand copper iron metabolism.
That's insane.
Everything is based on the everything's based on the mean. you're anemic, you're copper toxic. And that mindset, it's not just in the public, it's in the practitioner mindset as well.
That's insane. Okay, so treatment for tinnitus. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Just so folks know, I do have tinnitus, and I've not been figured out how to crack that code. This doctor I was talking with this morning says he thinks he knows how to cure it. I said I can't wait to come to your office. So that started for me in 2012 when I moved to Louisiana, and there was a lot of iron in the water. And literally within being there a week, I got headaches and I got tinnitus that I'd never had before. I was able to get over the headaches pretty quickly. Tinnitus has lingered, and I don't know what it is. I think it's something somewhere between the liver and the cilia of the inner ear. Something's not right, and I have gone round and round and round. So,
Interesting.
even Cooperman is vulnerable to tinnitus. I just want people to know that.
Yeah, none of us are gods here. So,
That's right.
what
Right.
what is the number of times a healthy adult should remove a pint of blood per year?
Well, I think if it's a postmenopausal woman or a guy, on a quarterly basis would be advisable. If it's a woman who's still menstruating, I typically recommend 2 times a year. But there are quite a few women in the community, RCP community, who do it 3 and 4 times a year. So again, it's up to personal preference, but I think that it's easy to donate a pint each quarter for an adult, especially someone who's over 50 or in their 50s and beyond, because most women don't have a menstrual cycle after that.
Because it's a roughly, depending obviously, but roughly about 250 milligram depletion, right?
Yes. So most people have about 50% of the blood is iron. That's what hematocrit means. It's taking the hemoglobin number times 3. So if someone has, let's say they've got 14%, or their hemoglobin's 14. So 3 times 14 is 52. So that means that 52% of their blood has iron.
Interesting.
So
Oh,
that if they're donating 500 milliliters, 500 times 0.52 is the amount of milligrams of iron they're going to donate. Does that make
okay.
sense?
That makes total sense. Yeah. Next question is, has Morley ever worked with someone with PNH, peroxisomal nocturnal hemoglobinuria? Is that right?
No, I've not, but that doesn't mean anything. Again, I'm pretty confident that what's playing in the background is unchecked oxidative stress, and we'd need to identify what the enzymes are and what would be some of the contributing factors. But no, I don't hold myself out as this expert or that expert. What I'm an expert at is understanding where the fatigue comes from that's causing the rise of oxidative stress, that's causing this symptom or that symptom, or this label or that label.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't matter whether it's a heart disease or some kind of brain disorder, whatever. So I'm certainly willing to explore it if they want to reach out to me. People always know my email address, morleyrobbins@gmail, and feel free to give me a call, 847-922-8061.
Nice. Okay, here we go. So often I mention on our Instagram that coffee is or can be an iron, block absorption of iron. And it says here, when blocking iron with coffee, tea, or dairy, won't these also block copper?
I've never read that they do. I think it's an intriguing question, but
Yeah.
I have clients who are low in copper, and they find that when they go to Starbucks to get a cup of coffee, it causes them anxiety, which would suggest that something's dysregulating their copper and iron. And I've never read that that copper would be threatened. But what I do know, or at least I shouldn't say I know, I've long suspected that people who do coffee enemas, they do get symptom relief. I understand that. But I think they are causing copper dysregulation when they do that. And so maybe what this individual is raising is maybe there's an impact on copper that we're not even aware of. Just a kind of an unsettling thought.
And as an aside, I think our language is really important too, because when we say, like you always mention, saying high and low, it's meaningless. And when we say, how, won't these block copper? Well, there's enzymes involved and there's processes involved. So blocking copper, like what does that actually mean? So I think it's important for people to, kind of be more direct with their words, I think,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, and absolutely. And the other thing we got to think about is that I'm reading a very interesting book about melanin. It's the title is "Copper is the Source of Melanin and All Life," and it's based on religious texts from the Republic of Mali in Africa, ancient religious texts. It's a fascinating book because it's giving a historical perspective of the origin of life on the planet from their perspective, and they claim that there's two sources of life, and it's copper and water, which is it's mind-bending to think about it in that historical sense. But what people have to be thinking about is that our ancestors, especially our ancient ancestors, had access to copper through their water, through their foods. It was, any plant that has seeds, if you eat those seeds, you're going to be getting some copper. Nuts and seeds are a very rich source of copper. Not so much in the modern era because of what they've done to change the seeds that are used.
Mm-hmm.
And there are animals that had a propensity to eat those types of copper-rich foods. The copper-rich foods that a cow would have eaten would certainly have been the grass, the alfalfa. But, again, that's all been lost. The use of GMO now is pervasive. And now we have to contend not with just the change in the water supply, not just the change of what's happening in the air. We have to deal with the change in the food system, and then we have to deal with changes in the pharmaceutical system. And so what I would contend is we've moved through 3 stages of a loss of copper. Starting about 100 years ago, we've gone from copper deficiency to copper depletion, and now we're in the stage of copper deprivation. And I think we're being actively deprived of copper in our environment, and it's not a sustainable model. And that's really what drove me to develop the Recuperate product, just so that people would know that they were getting this critical mineral to drive their metabolic functions in their body.
And wants to know, does the RCP help with high mercury on an HTMA?
It will certainly support the recovery of the liver. I've had clients that have cleared their mercury, focusing more on magnesium and Fiji water than just the RCP per se. Because I would help people before the RCP was in existence. That was our focus years ago. And again, what people don't know is that there's something called MERCAP enzymes, and they're really important for the liver, and they're really good at removing mercury. And I'll let you guess who the battery is for the MERCAP enzyme.
Here's another question. Why do some people report feeling good after taking iron?
Great question. Because there's if you really want to get into it for the gearheads, there's a famous study by Dr. Hodges, Hodges, Robert Hodges, 1978, where he wanted to find out. What's that?
Oh, sorry.
Okay. But his study was to look at this very mechanism of why do people feel better with iron?
Mm-hmm.
And what he really was, it was a study was like 600 days long because he really wanted to get to the bottom of it. And when he took He took all forms of beta carotene and retinol out of the diet, and he was just focused on retinol. He wasn't even thinking about copper. And it's a really important study to be aware of, but it shows this marked decline in hemoglobin over the course of this first year of the experiment. And as the vitamin A deficiency built, the hemoglobin got lower and lower and lower. And then what Dr. Hodges did was he brought in an iron supplement. And as predicted, there was this momentary blip, a rise in hemoglobin that lasted for about 6 weeks. And then it collapsed. And that's what happens to people. Invariably, they get this spike in hemoglobin production. And what he talks about in the article is that any heavy metal, arsenic, iron, you name the heavy metal, it will cause a spike in hemoglobin production. But if copper is not there, it's not sustainable. Why? Because you don't have the recycling program. You got to have the recycling. And then the most amazing part of the study, and it truly is I think it's one of the most important studies I've ever read. He starts to introduce retinol and beta carotene into the diet. And there is this explosion in the production of hemoglobin. And it's absolutely dramatic to see how the change in the diet to incorporate vitamin A, both precursor and preformed, the dramatic change in the hemoglobin production. And it went back to normal once the diet was established around a more complete diet. So it's a momentary blip that's triggered by heavy metals stimulating the hemoglobin production, but it's not sustainable unless copper is a part of the mix as well.
Yeah, interesting. Is there any connection between iron and vitiligo?
Yes. Well, vitiligo is sort of that bleaching of the skin. Or no, yeah, vitiligo is the bleaching. I'm thinking vertigo versus vitiligo. Vitiligo is the bleaching. So the melanin does not happen without tyrosinase enzyme. A tyrosinase enzyme has 2 coppers in it. And again, we get into triage situations. If there's a shortage of copper, the body has to decide, where are we going to cut back? And I'm sorry, I'm going to try to keep you alive. I'm going to try to keep you producing energy. I'm not going to worry about what your skin looks like. And it starts to sacrifice that going forward.
That's interesting. Okay, here's a good question about cod liver oil and a woman's 9-year-old daughter. Is that right? Well, it just says 9-year-old. Okay, so she says, if we experience major breakouts when taking cod liver oil, should we take less or should we push through it? I have a 9-year-old getting acne since taking CLO.
But first question would be, what kind of cod liver oil is being used? And we really are very insistent that Rositas and the jigsaw are pretty important. The acne just tells us that there isn't proper copper metabolism. So then I would wonder if there's sufficient copper in this child's body. I don't know whether they're doing the full protocol or they're just cherry picking the protocol. And it would be nice to know what's been playing in the background historically. Have they had ear infections, sinus infections, throat infections? Have they been taking antibiotics? Have they been exposed to chemicals that I know are very disruptive to copper metabolism? Is that a factor? What I would caution this family against is, don't think that Accutane is going to solve this problem. I've worked with over 6,500 people in 11 years, and hands down, far and away, the sickest people I've ever dealt with are the people who took Accutane. And the mistake that's made with Accutane is that they think it's copper toxicity, that it creates copper toxicity, and that's 180 degrees from the truth. What it does is it accelerates the action of a critical copper enzyme that's supposed to load copper into enzymes. It's called ATP7A. And what Accutane does is it puts that pump on steroids and it sucks all of the copper out of the body.
Wow.
And it's a very serious situation. I'd need to see what's going on with this individual. It's very rare that I hear someone getting acne by taking cod liver oil. So again, there may be some variables there that need to be evaluated and discussed. And what really happens is people ask me complicated questions like this, expecting yes or no, or do this, don't do that. You need
I
to have a
know, right?
conversation. You got to have a conversation. You've got to create the context of what's going on in the family, what's going on in the diet. What are the stresses for this child? What are they worrying about? And I'm not trying to be Dr. Phil. I'm just trying to understand what's the stress mosaic playing in the background of the acne. And then anytime you've got some issue expressing on the face or on the skin, well, it's a conflict between the largest organ inside the body, called the liver, not being able to clear some toxin. Usually, in this case, it's fat that's not being metabolized properly. And if the liver can't clear it, it will send it to the largest organ outside the body, called the skin. And why is it on the face? Just to get your attention to say something's not right.
Mm-hmm. Here's a good question about the MRI contrast gadolinium, and it says, does the RCP protocol work to help push gadolinium from the tissues similarly to iron?
That is a great question.
That's an interesting question.
I can't guarantee. What people need to know is that iron has 4 unbound electrons. And to the physicists in the audience, they're like freaking out right now. 4 unbound electrons, that's not good.
Yeah.
And gadolinium has 5 unbound electrons. And it's very toxic, as this person knows, very disruptive. Dr. Liz came across a very funny cartoon. It was two atoms walking down the street, and one says to the other, I think I've lost an electron. The other atom says, are you sure? And the first atom says, I'm positive.
Nice.
But the thing is, unpaired electrons in the body are very disruptive. They are, and what's important for people to understand is that in one molecule of ferritin, there might be 10,000 unpaired electrons. One molecule of ferritin, and that in the form of when ferritin gets denatured, it starts to be stored at a level 10 times higher. And then we're talking about one molecule of denatured ferritin has 100,000 unpaired electrons. And the physicists in the audience are suddenly understanding that's like having a nuclear reactor in your tissue, creating this oxidative stress. And people just aren't aware of this dynamic. That we've been trained to believe that iron is our friend and copper is the enemy. And in fact, we now know everything's backwards. Mm-hmm. Everything's backwards. So it's a great question. I can't guarantee that I've got a really good friend who's a very gifted radiologist. I'll ask him about that because he's very switched on with the RCP, and I'll see what he has to say about the gadolinium. That'd be kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it would be interesting because that metal would have to be or act similarly to iron in terms of like allowing it to be manipulated by copper and regulated by copper and stuff. Okay, so here's a good question. Iron toxicity could it be related or involved with dyslexia? It seems like dyslexia is on the rise.
Yeah, I've heard, I've seen what are non-peer-reviewed articles that seem to imply that dyslexia is tied to copper dysregulation. I just have never studied it. It makes sense to me intuitively, but I think the fact that if it's on the rise, then I think we look to what have been the most significant changes in our environment in the last 100 years. Well, there's been an 80% loss of copper in the soil on farms in the last 80 years. No other mineral has faced that level of loss. And the amount of iron we're exposed to, especially in the last 70 years, is just staggering. And again, people think, well, it's got to be more than that. Well, let's just start there. To lose 80% of the mineral that regulates iron, and then let's increase the amount of iron we're exposed to biblical proportions. We just don't appreciate what that mismatch has done metabolically in our body.
Yeah, it's wild. Here's an interesting question of a condition I had never heard of before. It's called spoon nails, and it's Koilonychia, coilonychia. And it says here, want to hear his insights on spoon nails, aka coilonychia. Apparently, it's iron related. Do you want me to read to you a little blurb about it?
Sure, yeah, that'd be
It
fun.
says here, coilonychia, whatever it's called, also known as spoon nails, is a nail disease that can be a sign of hypochronic anemia, especially iron deficiency anemia. It refers to abnormally thin nails which have lost their convexity, becoming flat or even concave in shape.
Well, again, we have to be really careful with the words we use, which you've cautioned us about. Again, the iron deficiency is the watch phrase, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we got to know, where is it missing? It may not be showing up in the blood because it's at epic levels in the tissue and can't get out. And so there's a lot of research about iron deficiency based on blood work, not based on tissue sampling. It's very rare to see a study done with tissue sampling. I've maybe only seen it a few times. So
Mm-hmm.
that's the bait and switch that they play with in research, is get people hoodwinked around missing iron in the blood, thinking, again, we would think, well, if it's missing in the blood, of course it's going to be missing in the tissue. But
Mm-hmm.
that's not reality. Bruce Ames and his partner Kalilia discovered in 2004, by studying fibroblasts, which are very important cells, that there can be a tenfold increase in iron in the tissue, even when it shows low in the blood. And that's a staggering difference
Wow.
of reality, that it can be really low in the blood, but it can be 10 times higher in the tissue. Well, when I read that study, that's when I began to really zero in on the copper iron dynamic, began to realize that there's a complete gross misunderstanding about iron. And then I read an article after that by a famed Italian group of researchers, and one of the first sentences said, "The greatest stress to human beings is iron stress." Well, that's a game changer. And suddenly
Jeez.
we have a different understanding of iron and oxygen have this magnetic attraction for each other. And there's only one metal that can regulate both of them and keep them from creating rust, and that's copper. And while it's known in the intelligentsia circles, it's not taught in the clinical circles. And that's where it's needed. That's where the crisis is. And we need to get this understanding into the social circles so that more people are not distracted by low iron in the blood, and they have the good sense to realize it's a seesaw function. And if iron is low in the blood, it's going to be high in the tissue, and the inverse holds for copper. If copper is high in the blood, ding ding ding, guess what it means? It means it's low in the tissue. And that's what the research from the 1920s and 30s was very clear about.
Mm-hmm. Here's a good one. This is a statement. So we got a question about iron detoxing and muscle building, but this other says here from Haley, no question, but I'm very grateful for Morley and his work. I'm only 5 months into it, so that's cool.
That's great.
Um,
Thank you, Haley.
yeah, and this one here is how does detoxing iron play a role in muscle building? Would it?
Well, it's a great question. How is detoxing? Well,
Oh,
I think the key is going to be making sure that the iron is being properly recycled and utilized. And um, there's a lot of folks who do um, bodybuilding who use supplements. They're going to increase the anabolic function. And when you start to build up the anabolic steroids, you better be metabolizing iron effectively. Because again, it plays very important roles in the body, but we've got to be able to recycle it properly.
mm-hmm. That makes sense. Here's a good question. Best forms of copper other than bisglycinate and besides food. Uh,
Best forms of best forms of what?
Best forms of copper other than bisglycinate besides food.
Um, well, again, we go back to the ancestral diet, and if you have access to um, these historical foods, nuts and seeds, and like pumpkin seeds and things like of that nature, historically they would have been full of copper. I shouldn't say full, but they would have been sources of copper. Potatoes were a source of copper.
Uh-huh.
Again, any food in the modern era that has been turned into a GMO product, there's a reason why it's done. They've done that, and that's to eliminate the availability of copper in that food. The phrase that was used on a farm, that horse is feeling its oats. What's in oats to give the horse the energy? It was copper. Well, now oats are GMO, alfalfa, GMO, sugar beets, GMO, corn, GMO, soybean, GMO. You catching a pattern here? And so these rich sources of lentils, GMO, all these rich sources of copper historically. The beer that our ancestors would have eaten was brewed in copper vats. Now those vats have glass lining. Everything's changed. The whole access to the metal has been methodically, I would argue, methodically cut off.
Mm.
A nip and tuck here and there, year in and year out, begins to add up. And now we're witnessing this seismic shortage of a mineral that has allowed higher life forms to exist on the planet.
That's interesting. Here's a good one about what about other metals like cadmium, aluminum, etc.? What makes iron the most dangerous?
Just the sheer volume of it.
Hmm.
Again, it's 5,000 milligrams. That's a lot of iron. Again, we can't fathom. To put it into context, we have 100 milligrams of copper. Well, that fits on the head of a 1-inch stick pin. 5,000 milligrams. That's what the ideal is. You're talking about your situation at 46. Well, I'm 69. You multiply 365 times that, and it's a 26,000 or something. It's a big number. It's like there's a lot of iron in my tissues. Now, I've been working pretty diligently to lower it, but it's like, listen, for those that are curious about what causes aging, it's not complicated. It's called iron accumulation. Every facet of aging, 100% of the symptoms of aging are iron-induced oxidative stress, period. Even the shortening of the telomeres, even the loss of energy, the thinning of skin, the loss of hair, the wrinkles, all of it, every facet of aging, memory loss is all attributed to iron is building up and is getting dysregulated somewhere in the body and the brain.
There's that book, right, by Jim Moon, the Iron, the Most Toxic Metal, that this person might want to check out, right?
Yeah, I've read it 5 times. It's an amazing book. You will learn things in that book that you don't really want to know. And no, it's seriously, people, we live in this Disney world thinking that everything's okay. It's not okay. We're beginning to learn that. And what's been playing in the background, in my humble opinion, has been this we've been introduced to all these toxins, and there's only one toxin we really need to be focused on, and that's iron and its interaction with oxygen. And, you know, oxygen, second most reactive element on the planet after fluorine gas. Well, that's noteworthy. What's the master pro-oxidant on the planet? Iron. So when you mix iron and oxygen, you have an explosion. And we know what it does to metal outside the body. Well, it's doing the exact same thing inside the body. It's just no one knew that the literature, when it was referring to oxidative stress, was being very polite and not use the phrase rust.
Hmm. Does red wine increase iron absorption and coffee inhibit iron absorption? I've heard that about coffee.
Coffee, yes, but the red wine, um, Mildred Seelig, who was a famed magnesium researcher, um, she was legendary for saying, it's okay to have a glass or two of wine. Just you're going to lower your stress by doing that. She
Huh?
says you start to have too much wine, that can be a problem. I don't know that. I don't know if red wine would contribute to um, iron buildup. What too much alcohol does is um, there's a process whereby copper is needed to metabolize that alcohol. When copper gets lost, iron starts to accumulate in the liver. Well, anyone who knows anyone who's had an alcohol problem knows that one of the downsides is you get cirrhosis of the liver. And that cirrhosis is a calcification of the liver. Well, what preceded the calcification? The iron buildup that caused the oxidative stress that led to the calcification.
Makes sense. Here's a good one. Let's see. Oh, okay. So this is interesting because, like you said before, there's so much context to these questions. But it says here, how to best remove iron overload in young children. I mean, that's a
That's
that's a
that.
loaded question.
It's a loaded question, and there is no good answer to that. Unfortunately, you have
Yeah.
to do it through diet. The most important thing that people can do is prevent the problem from the get-go, and that would mean that the mom would have to be really vigilant on
Hmm.
be aware of how she can pass iron to the child in utero, and it happens all the time, but people don't know that.
Here's a good question. I'm having an infected root canal removed next month. How soon after is it safe to donate blood?
Ooh, wow,
That's a good one, huh?
that is a good one.
Hmm.
Um, I really don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. Infected tooth. I guess to be conservative, wait a couple months and then do it. I mean, that's what. If, I'm not sure I'm sure there's more to the story than just the infected tooth, but
Yeah.
I would be really focusing on the protocol and then allow that to work its magic and then do the blood donation after there's been some mobilization of the iron.
Hmm. Let's do one final question. And this, we kind of touched on a little bit earlier in terms of chelating iron. And this person says, are there any other ways to dump iron besides donating blood?
Hands down, donating blood it's recognized in all the literature. There is no active mechanism to get rid of excess iron. There's no hormonal pathway, there's no enzymatic pathway. Gravity is recognized as the primary way. There are, you can do sweat lodges, and, you can, sweat will get um, some iron out, but it's the difference between a straw and a fire hose. And
Hmm.
so, again, the what the more sophisticated iron biologists say is the best way to regulate iron is through your mouth and through gravity. Mouth restrict its inflow, gravity allow it to flow.
Hmm. And
And
then the amount of iron that we have in our body, I mean, maybe we'll never get down to the 5,000 that's optimal, but I think the goal is to deplete it as much as you can, but then make sure it's activated and mobilized instead of being stuck and stored. And so that's, the majority of the root cause protocol is focused primarily on that, right?
Exactly. That's all. That's the whole focus. Absolutely.
Um, Really interesting. Isn't lactoferrin a pretty good iron chelator in terms of something you could take?
It is. It's found in milk, in unprocessed milk, in breast milk, but it's not found in the white liquid that's sold in supermarkets.
Uh-huh.
It's sold as a supplement. I don't know how. I mean, there is, for those who are unable to donate or have a fear or some restriction. There's a product that I regularly recommend. It's made by one of my students, one of my graduates. It's called Eye Detox, and it has lactoferrin and IP6 and quercetin, and it's legendary for helping to chelate it. But again, it's not the replacement, a total replacement for a blood donation, but it's very effective at helping to pull iron out of the blood and the tissue.
Do you know the name of that? Because when I search for eye detox on Google, it doesn't. Is there a website associated with it?
The the irontruth.com.
So the with a word
Yeah,
the in front of it,
theirontruth.com.
truth.com. Because chelators are also something I think could be helpful for people. There we
Sure.
go. Eye detox. There we go.
Yeah, it's a great
Have you
product.
have you tried it? Yeah.
Oh yeah. Oh, absolutely. No, I rely on the blood donations, but I've used eye detox just to see what it felt like. It felt
Yeah.
great.
Very cool. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, thanks for that. And I mean, there's a couple other questions, but we kind of touched on them about raising hemoglobin and stuff like that. We did that earlier in the show, but oh my
And
gosh. Okay. So
I'm going to turn into a pumpkin because I got to get somewhere in the next few minutes. But go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah, no, I just wanted to let people know where to find you, and your upcoming RCP training is going to be this July, right? 2022.
Yep, July 7th. The cutoff is going to be the 20th of June.
Okay.
We'll be accepting payments until the 20th. Then we've got to have a couple weeks to catch our breath and get ready for the classes. And so people are interested in the RCP Institute. It'd be a great time. We're looking forward to a banner class. People want to learn more, go to the Facebook group, Magnesium Advocacy Group. They can go to the page, the RCP page on Facebook. There's a website, rcp123.org. And then if people want to reach out to me personally, I've given the email address and phone number, and they're certainly welcome to reach out.
Awesome. Morley, thank you so much. I know you got to run. I appreciate your time today, my friend, and can't wait
Absolutely.
to do it again.
And be sure to follow through based on our earlier conversation at the beginning, okay?
Definitely, 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 definitely.
Okay. All right. Very good. All right.
Thanks,
Catch up
Morley.
with you later. Take care.
Okay.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right, there you go, my friends. Episode 737. I hope you enjoyed that show. And if I didn't get to your question, I apologize. We had so many questions. So I appreciate it so, so much. I really appreciate you guys listening and sharing the show. And make sure to check out our two sponsors for today's show, and check out the MitoLife products. I think you're going to love them. And I'll put links to everything we talked about at extremehealthradio.com/737. I'm going to keep it short. If you guys would like to support our work, make sure the biggest way to do that probably would be to check out our store, biochargeme.com. And that would be a great way to support us. Just click through on any of the products. And usually we have discount codes for most of them. And that's a great way to support the work that we do. If you're an avid purchaser of MitoLife products or the Lifeblood Blood Methylene Blue and the products he has over there, use our discount codes EHR10 and EHR15 on MitoLife and Lifeblood. That would be a great way to support us as well. If you want to go further, we have an Extreme Health Academy. That's a monthly fee, and that's a great way to support the work and get more information about putting all the puzzle pieces together. And we have live calls every Friday morning. I'm live every single week, and then Dr. Bergman is live once a month on the third Sunday of every month. Other ways to support us, if you shop on Amazon, just go to our link on Extreme Health Radio at the homepage, scroll to the bottom, click on that link, and that'll support us. I appreciate you guys doing that because I think mostly, yes, we get a little compensation, like it's really small percentage. I forget what it is. But most importantly, you take a little bit of money from Jeff Bezos's pocket, and that's always a plus, right? So anytime I buy online, I always look to, click on someone's affiliate link, someone I know that's doing good work out there that I want to support, or if they have a coupon code. I'm more interested in supporting their work because that's how we're able to do this and create this kind of content is when you guys support our work. So I appreciate you buying through MitoLife and on Lifeblood and through Amazon and stuff like that. So check out our store and our sponsors. We really appreciate that. And again, I'll put a link to everything we talk about on today's show at extremehealthradio.com/737. Thank you for sharing us. Really appreciate that on Instagram. That really helps us. I really appreciate you guys doing that. Appreciate you guys so much, and I'll see you guys on the next episode.